Dear friends, welcome to the NT podcast, the place where science and theology meet. Today we are honored to have Dr. Jens Bruun Kofoed with us. Professor Kofoed, welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
Thank you also. And for those who don't know, Professor Kofoed is an accomplished scholar specializing in the Old Testament with an impressive academic and professional background that spans decades. He has studied under prominent figures like Kenneth Kitchen and Alan Millard, and he has been involved in numerous research projects, including the renowned Bridging Data and Tradition Initiative. In this episode, we will explore intriguing questions about the Exodus narrative, its historical and theological dimensions, and the broader context of Old Testament studies. Our discussion will address topics such as cultural memory, theological traditions, and the interpretation of complex biblical texts. All right, I have a ton of questions, so let's start with first one. Egyptologist Jan Assmann proposed the cultural memory theory in his reconstruction of the mnemohistory of the Exodus. Could you tell us more about this theory and how memory and the recollection of certain events like the Exodus function, and what your perspective is on this?
Yeah, well, Assmann's theory of cultural memory focuses on how societies construct and pass down collective memories. Excuse me. And particularly transformative events, that is, very important events in relation to the collective identity, like the Exodus. And Assmann's argument is that memory shapes identity and cultural continuity, and very often, and this is especially clear when he tackles the Exodus, very often memory is tampering with historical facts, so that it's more a recreation of a tradition and a history than a recollection of real historical events. Um, from my perspective, Jan Assmann makes the mistake that just because it is cultural memory, it is likely not also to be historical memory or reliable history. Mnemohistory, that is, the way we remember our history, has to be questioned and investigated like any other source. So we need to ask the same questions about mnemo-historical narratives, the same questions that we ask of any other historical source. And for that reason, it's perfectly probable from a historical point of view that the Exodus tradition is not only mnemohistory, but also a reliable historical memory.
Amazing. And we have some traditions in prophets like Hosea, Amos, Micah, and other minor prophets. So, do we find some different traditions of the Exodus in those books
Mhm.
compared to original text in the book of Exodus? And also, how can we explain these different theological emphases and motifs that differ from the book of the Exodus?
Mhm. I think we first of all need to remember that the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible um, is a unique source. We don't have anything like it. And one of the special things or unique things about the Old Testament is that we can trace traditions over a very long time span. We have no other sources in world history where we can do that. And precisely because the Old Testament is unique in that respect, it's I think it's obvious that there are natural explanations for different approaches to traditions. And it is completely true that the Exodus tradition in Exodus is quite different from the way it appears in the Minor Prophets. In the book of Exodus, the Exodus narrative is about a historical event and its importance for the Israelite people, for the birth of Israel as a nation, really. It comes only slightly later in Exodus 19, but it's part of that birth of the Israelite nation. In the Minor Prophets, we find a more theological approach to the Exodus. But again, just because the Minor Prophets take a theological approach to the Exodus narrative, it doesn't mean that the historical event didn't occur. You could easily argue the adverse, namely that it is precisely because it was such a groundbreaking historical event that it continued to play a role also in the people's theological history. And I mean, the Exodus tradition, as we find it in Exodus, is not only historical, it is also theological. And sociological for that sake. So it's not very surprising to me that one of the elements in the original story in Exodus, namely the theological element, comes to play a major role in the Minor Prophets. I'm talking a lot here, just interrupt me if necessary. The situation in the Minor Prophets, or the background of the Minor Prophets, is quite different from that in Exodus. In the Minor Prophets, we are dealing with a covenantal disloyalty from Israel and Judah. And if we go back to Exodus, this is where the covenant is made, really. And when the covenant is betrayed, the covenant between Israel and the people, it's only natural, I think, when Hosea, Amos, and Micah, in particular, grabs the theological element of the Exodus narrative and uses it to display the covenant betrayal of the people.
Thank you. So, if I correctly understand you, Exodus is not only purely a historical question. That's an interdisciplinary method when we apply theology, history, sociology, and other science. And yeah, do you agree with that?
Absolutely. Many scholars have demonstrated that there are both historical, theological, and sociological or social elements in the Exodus. I mean, the people was liberated from slavery, and later, as I mentioned in Exodus 19 and on, Israel is created as a kind of counter people with a very egalitarian and almost democratic identity. So there are many layers and aspects in the Exodus, and the historical one is, of course, foundational because if it didn't happen, it was just a fairy tale and a story, and fairy tales and stories do not. We know that from history. They do not have the same importance for a people's identity as historical events do. Take the Holocaust, for example. If the Holocaust narrative or tradition only had been in an invented tradition, it wouldn't have had the impact on the identity of the Jewish people today as it has.
Okay, Dr. Kofoed, now can you explain the difference between the myth of the Exodus and Abraham? In your books, you explained those similarities and differences. So can you explain how those narratives develop? Yeah.
Yeah, excuse me. I've been ill with pneumonia for a couple of weeks, so I'm still coughing a lot. Um, yes, um, it bothers me a little bit to call the narratives myths because from a literary perspective, the concept of myth is reserved for different texts. I mean, what we have in the Abraham narrative and in the Exodus narrative is, at least on the surface, a plain narrative. It's very different from, for example, Genesis 3, which I would call a myth, but that's a topic for another talk. Having said that, there are, of course, differences between the Abraham narrative and the Exodus narrative. If we do respect the internal chronology and historical reliability of the narratives themselves, we are dealing with two quite different time periods. I mean, the Abraham narrative takes place in the very beginning of the second millennium BC, whereas the Exodus narrative is at the end of the second millennium BC. So there are historical and for the same reason, cultural differences. I guess you are hinting at the difference in the portrayal of God and the faith of Abraham and the Israelites. And when I mentioned the historical and cultural differences, it was quite on purpose actually, because the expression of one's faith, and I believe also the way God chooses to reveal himself depends on who you are, of course, but also on the culture and history in which you are situated. Um, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, whom we call the patriarchs, were part of a very traditional, what we would call nomadic society, and with the clan as the most basic unit in society, and I find it very natural that God reveals himself to Abraham in the very direct way he does. If we go to the Exodus narrative, it's very clear from, for example, Exodus 3, but also later in Exodus 6, that at least, again, if we take the reliability and chronology of the narrative for granted, it's very clear that God has decided to step up, so to speak, in his revelation and display more of who he is and what it looks like for God to act in history than he had done to Abraham and previous generations. I don't think, or to put it differently, it's possible that Abram and the patriarchs knew God's personal or covenantal name, Yahweh. But what is new in Exodus is that God decides to demonstrate or show in historical action what it means for him to be Yahweh. The very enigmatic expression in Exodus 3, where God tells Moses that I am who I am, basically means that you'll see by my actions what I am going to do, who I am. So there are clear differences, but um, in the larger narrative, I think it's explained by the differences in historical and cultural and personal circumstances.
That makes a lot of sense. So, okay, and now let's shift to next topic about source criticism. Let's say, do you believe in the documentary hypothesis and how Pentateuch was made, how many authors, and dating and other stuff? So, can you address that?
Yeah, the short answer is no, I don't. And I think it's a flawed and a very outdated approach to how the Old Testament came to be. Um, One of the reasons why I reject it is a very obvious one, that we don't have one single original manuscript of those alleged sources. We don't have a Yahwist or Elohist or Deuteronomist or priestly manuscript that proves that before the Old Testament came to be what it is today, um, it it consisted of a various number of original sources. So it's a very weak theory seen from a historian's viewpoint, because we completely lack sources for the idea. Another reason why I reject it is that it is, at least in its original form, very much based on the German philosopher Hegel's evolutionary understanding of development in religion. In that understanding, a religion begins very animistic and anthropomorphic, and as a very simple, naive approach to life and God, and develops over time so that the relationship between man and God becomes more and more distant and hindered. And of course, in that perspective, the Yahwist source is all the texts in the Old Testament, primarily in the Pentateuch, that describes the relationship between man and God in those very simple and naive and anthropomorphic terms, whereas the priestly code describes this very regulated access man has to God. There is no direct access to God anymore. And what proponents of this traditional source criticism does is actually to take this understanding of development and religion, and then they pick all the texts, no matter how they function in the text as we have it, and place them either in the Yahwist source, the Deuteronomistic source, or the priestly code. And the result is a very fragmented text in the first place, but also a text that has nothing to do with history. So for that reason, I find it both very, very unlikely from a historian's point of view, and very flawed. And the truth is that there are very few scholars today that adhere to at least the traditional version of the documentary hypothesis. Most scholars today actually only talk about P and non-P. That is, a text in the Pentateuch is either a priestly text written by this circle, which is called the priestly code, or it's something else. Many scholars have stopped distinguishing between the Yahwist, the Elohist, and the Deuteronomist. So there is some sort of awareness also in historical critical research that the foundation of the traditional historical critical source criticism is flawed. Having said that, I think it's just as important to realize that the Old Testament has been put together by someone at some point in time, and that we have to speak about a redaction history. We have to talk about sources, but in a different way than the documentary hypothesis does. And I mean, it's somewhat the same as with the Assmann theory of mnemohistory. Just because the Old Testament has been put together with different sources, it doesn't take any away from the coherence of the Old Testament and the historical reliability of the events and people described in the Old Testament. The best example to me is the Pentateuch. We have no author who signed the Pentateuch saying, I, Moses, wrote all of this. In the Pentateuch, we are told that Moses did write something, but nowhere that he wrote everything. So I take it for granted, especially because the essence of the texts in Genesis are very different from those of Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. That Genesis has been is a result of a putting together of different sources. There are many signs of that, and I could elaborate on that if necessary. And maybe Moses did it, but it's also possible that someone had already done it when Moses wrote what he did.
Yes, and what is your view when you date that?
The best answer is we don't know. um, the oldest existing physical manuscripts are those from Qumran, dating to the second and third centuries before Christ. And there's a huge gap between the, let's say, the third century and the events described, for example, in Genesis. So there is a very, very long transmission history. We have good reason, and I did my PhD on that. We have very good reason to believe that the original manuscripts were transmitted faithfully and reliably so that we can trust the historical information, even though there is this century-long gap between the oldest physical manuscripts and the original. But we also need to take into account that some of the narratives, some of the texts were transmitted orally for a long period, especially the genealogical information in Genesis. These are the generations of Noah and Terah and Jacob, etc. Especially that kind of information was likely to be transmitted orally in the families and in the villages. So it's very difficult to say anything about when the texts were written, and I'm very reluctant to put on any date on them. The creation account in Genesis 1 is also a good example. Scholars, especially historical critical scholars, um, have for centuries almost argued that it was written as a polemic against Babylonian religion in the seventh century. But if you look at the polemic in Genesis 1, you might just as well argue that it's a polemic against the Egyptian religion at the time of Moses. And my approach to that is that maybe both arguments are right. I don't see any problem in a very early creation narrative with the polemics against Egyptian religion in the time of Moses, and then um, reuse or even redaction of the creation account at a later stage where Egyptian religion was not a problem, but the Babylonian one was.
Okay, so do you believe in some P or priestly source that really existed or not?
Not really. What I do believe is that a number of texts in the Pentateuch um, are influenced by what we could call priestly theology. I would prefer to call it temple theology. I think that both the creation account and the um, uh, the beginning of the narrative on humanity in Genesis 2 um, are both influenced by the understanding of how the temple was a miniature of God's creation. So I would prefer to talk about the theology that was connected to the temple, and in that regard, yes, it is priestly, but I don't think there was a priestly source, an original document with actual texts. I think more of it as one of the theologies in the Old Testament. We also have a wisdom tradition, and we have other traditions, the Exodus tradition, for example. And these traditions contribute to the understanding on the relationship between humanity and God, the people of God and Yahweh, in different ways, and do not necessarily contradict each other, but complement each other.
All right, let's address some problems with the texts from Torah. So the first one is, what was the name of Moses' father-in-law? In Exodus 2, Numbers 10, it's Reuel, or Exodus 3 or 18, we have Jethro. So what is the answer?
Yeah, and it's much worse than that actually, because in Numbers 10:29, Hobab is mentioned as the son of Reuel the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law. So we have a bunch of names here, and um, one solution, which is often the solution chosen by historical critical scholars, is that we have different sources, different names. Um, are evidence of different sources. We have already spoken about the documentary hypothesis and why there's reason to view it as flawed. My own take on this problem is that there might be two explanations for the names. One of them is that people had more than one name, and there are ample evidence in the Old Testament of that. The first ones are, of course, Abraham, um, Sarai, Sarah. We have Jacob, Israel, but we also have evidence that, for example, Esau is called Edom, which is not a personal name per se, but the name of his clan or tribe or territory. Um, in addition to that, we also have evidence that people's names were changed. King Eliakim, for example, is renamed Jehoiakim when he's made king by Pharaoh Necho, as told in 2 Kings 23. So we have a number of instances where people have different names, and one name or the other is used very deliberately because each name has its own meaning. So it's possible that this is the case here, and that the man in question had all these names. What is more likely, perhaps, is that Reuel is the head of clan, and when he died, Hobab became clan leader. And these names, Reuel and Hobab, are therefore used as a designation for the clan Moses marries into, whereas Jethro is actually the personal name of Moses' father-in-law. I find that solution interesting because um, it's very much in line with the society described in those narratives, where you have this basic unit with the family and then the clan. So it would make sense to mention the clan leader as well as the father himself.
Yeah, that's interesting. We have also, for example, Jerubal, it's Gideon. So yeah, that's really
Exactly.
common. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so next question is since God does not seem to establish the Hebrew priesthood until Exodus 28:1, who are the priests referring to in Exodus 19:22-24, also Leviticus 1, Numbers 3. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think we find an explanation for that in the book of Numbers, chapter 3, verse 11, where it is said that the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Behold, I have taken the Levites from among the people of Israel instead of every firstborn who opens the womb among the people of Israel." So it seems that before the Levitical priesthood was established, the firstborn in the family actually functions as a kind of a priest or had a priestly role. So the Levites had predecessors, so to speak.
I wonder, what do you think about Levite hypothesis that only Levites were in Egypt and they come along with other Israelites that were already in Canaan whole time? So, what do you think
Hmm.
about that?
I think it can be boiled down to whether we take the Exodus narrative for a historical, reliable narrative or not. There are so many theories about how Israel came to be in Canaan, but many of them are based either on the documentary hypothesis or on downright disbelief in the historical information allegedly given in the texts. So if you reject the documentary hypothesis, and if you believe there's reason to respect the information in the Exodus narrative as historically reliable, well, then you have the answer. The sources tells us a different story.
Okay, thank you. I agree totally. So nice. And how do you explain now these narrative interruptions? Let's start with first, the book of Genesis ends with the description of Jacob's sons entering Egypt, while the book of the Exodus begins by describing how the Israelites became numerous in Egypt and how Pharaoh oppressed them. There is a gap of about 400 years between these two events, yet there is no mention of this time period. So,
Hmm. Yeah. Um, First of all, we do have other examples of missing time periods if we take the grand narrative of the whole Bible. So that's not unique. Um, Having said that, I think the books of Genesis and Exodus are very deliberately knit together because the first thing we are told in Exodus 1 is uh, that the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. This is, in my mind, a very deliberate link to the both the patriarchal narratives, but also to the primeval history, because what God called Abraham to do was actually to fulfill the mandate given to man in Genesis 1 to fill the earth, to be fruitful, to multiply. And what the book of Exodus opens with is actually a note about this is exactly what the Israelites did in Egypt and even in a hostile environment as they were living in Egypt. So I wouldn't make too much of this time gap. Historically speaking, the time gap also explains why the situation changed from the time of Joseph to the time described in Exodus 1.
Yes, and maybe 400 years is exaggerated because we have other variant and many problems with that because we know if Exodus happened in the time of Ramses II, so we cannot go further beyond 1550 BC. So that's less than 300. But yeah, okay, thank you. Nice explanation. So in Exodus 16:34, Aaron places the jar of manna before the Ark of the Covenant. Although the building of the Ark is not mentioned until Exodus 25 and onwards. This seems like a big problem. So
Yeah, there is a simple explanation because the ark, Aron in Hebrew, is not mentioned in that verse. It's a different word, edut, translated as the testimony. So I don't think the ark was constructed at this point of time, and the manna was placed in front of something else, something that symbolized the same as the Ark of the Covenant later came to symbolize also. But we do have a different word here than ark.
I didn't know that, so that really explains.
Yeah.
And yeah, in Exodus 38:26, the result of the census of the Israelites is known, but the census itself is described only later in Numbers 1.
Yeah, I think it's a literary device well known from Hebrew narrative that the result is often presented before the details are outlined. So we have a non-chronological description of what happened. And I think the author simply follows a literary convention presenting the result before he tells about how they reached that result.
Yeah, I heard that from other scholars also, because even in Genesis we have some conclusion at the beginning, and then yeah, so
Yeah,
that's a good answer.
yeah, yeah. But in a way, you have it in the first verse in the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God created everything. Now,
Yeah,
I'll tell you how he did it.
yeah, amazing. So next, in Exodus 24:1-2, Yahweh commands Moses to go up the mountain with Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the Israelite elders. They comply, but not until Exodus 24:9. In the meantime, in verses 3-8, Moses performs a covenant ceremony with the people based on the laws given in Exodus 20:19 to 23:33. Laws Yahweh gave to Moses on the same mountain. Moses is told to ascend in verse 1 before he has even come down in verse 3. Then in verses 9-11, Moses and the elders go up the mountain as instructed. Yet in verse 12, Moses is again instructed to ascend the mountain, even though he's already there. So this is a longer one, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah. In a way, this is a very complicated problem. And the reason why I mention that is that scholars for decades have been discussing How many times did Moses ascend the mountain? Um, I think um, what's going on here is that we have a non-linear um, narrative. That is, we don't have an account that describes strictly chronologically what happened. So it may be that some of the ascensions of Moses are retold more than once. To be honest, I haven't worked in detail with this problem, but one of my colleagues have, and what he's arguing is that the narrator is actually returning to the same going up the mountain in later texts, so that we cannot take for granted that we have a chronological linear narrative. I think that's my best explanation at this point.
Yeah, that's honest, but it makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean
So,
we do have the same difference in Genesis 1 and 2. Um, People often describe the relationship between Genesis 1 and 2 as one of discrepancy, but that's because you read Genesis 2 as a linear account, but it's a different approach to the creation than we have in Genesis 1. Genesis 1 is, of course, linear, day 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. But in Genesis 2, focus is on man, humanity, and therefore the sequence of events are in a different order. I think the same is going on in Exodus.
yeah, thank you. And the next one is Exodus 4:24 to 26 is an independent and obscure story, arguably the most unclear story considering its brevity, inserted in a way that disrupts the narrative at least. How do you explain this?
Yeah. Um, I'm not sure. Just to emphasize that you are completely right that it is enigmatic, and it occurs in a surprising place. I think the best explanation is that there was a need to emphasize um, covenant faithfulness at a very early stage of the Exodus narrative. The covenant itself is only made later between Moses or Israel and Yahweh, but describing uh, how the circumcision took place here serves to underline that not only Moses but also his wife and family um, were loyal to Yahweh. So it adds to the description of Moses and his family and of Moses as the leader God chose to lead his people out of Egypt.
Yeah, that makes sense because Dr. David Falk said that Moses cannot deliver his people if he's not a good father and if he doesn't obey commandments to his son. So he needs to, yeah, show some obedience. Yeah, that's the
Yeah.
word.
Mhm.
Okay, Deuteronomy 10:6 to 9 interrupts the continuity of Moses' speech in Deuteronomy 10.
I simply think that our expectations of the text is the cause of the problem. I mean, If you take Genesis 1 through 11, you have a very composite text as well, where we do have interruptions or different types of texts coming in all the time. And I simply understand these verses as a parenthesis, an explanation for priestly roles, and why the author or editor placed it here is hard to say. But I don't think we should expect the text to conform to how we would have written the text if we were to write it. So that's my best take on that.
Great, thank you again. And this is weird one. The story of Isaac blessing Jacob instead of Esau in Genesis 27 occurs while Isaac is dying in verse 1, as Esau explicitly acknowledged in verse 41. However, Isaac does not die until Genesis 35, 28 to 29, at least 21 years later, the time Jacob spent serving Laban. Alternately, following explicit chronological notices, perhaps even 80 years passed between Isaac's deathbed scene and his actual death. Thus, Genesis 27 disrupts the continuity of the narrative. So, this is weird.
It reminds me of something we experienced in our family, because I think we managed to take our children out of school 3 times in order to go to a different part of the country to visit my wife's grandmother because she was dying. And this took place over a period of 2 years. And it took 3 years before she actually died. But she was very weak and then very ill, and we actually thought all those 3 times that we were going to visit her for the last time. Jokes away, this is a fantastic and fascinating story, and I'm convinced that the narrator is using literary devices in a very clever manner to portray Isaac as something he isn't. I mean, Isaac was almost blind, and he had lost a number of his faculties, but he was completely aware of what was going on. This is not the impression you get on the surface of the text. But I do think that Isaac was very well aware of what was going on. There's no way that Jacob could fool him into thinking that he was Esau by clothing himself in a skin with fur. So I think the narrator portrays Isaac in a way that describes him as someone who needs an excuse for not having done the right thing from the beginning. He preferred Esau to Jacob, in spite of what God had told Rebekah. And Isaac needed an occasion to make this right. So I think he knew what was going on, and the portrayal of him as dying is one of the literary devices used by the narrator, and we should read between the lines. He may have been old, blind, and lost some of his faculties, but I think he knew what was going on, and he was not dying in that respect.
Yes, even Richard Elliot Friedman would acknowledge that there is a lot of irony and yeah, because he's blind, but he sees in some ways. So yeah, that's
Exactly.
interesting.
Exactly. Yeah.
And also years, maybe they are. How do you? What is your view on the patriarchal ages? Let's say Isaac was 180 years old. How you view
Hmm.
that? Is that historically or symbolically, or how?
Um, um, I tend to see the ages of humanity as described after the flood as realistic. Um, and the reason why is that from that time they are embedded in a quite exact chronological sequence. Um, I cannot rule out that some of the numbers are round numbers and maybe an expression of a full generation or something like that. But I tend to look at them as realistic. Whereas in Genesis 5, for example, I think something else is going on. I think we have a literary device again portraying humankind as being different before the flood than after the flood. With precisely the same things going on in the Mesopotamian prehistory, where kings reigned for thousands of years, and um, I think that's a way the author portrays reality before the flood as being different from life as we know it now.
Interesting. I agree. And the next problem is Genesis 38 interrupts the narrative about Joseph, which begins in Genesis 37 and continues in Genesis 39 to 50, to the end of Genesis. And with an independent section about Judah and Tamar. Joseph is not even mentioned at all.
Mm. If you read Jacob's blessing of his sons and the way some of that is repeated in Moses' blessing at the end of Deuteronomy of the Israelite tribes, it's very clear that two of the sons um, will come to play a very important role in the continuing salvation history in God's continuing plan, and that's Joseph and Judah. So in that light, I don't find it surprising that we also have a story focusing on Judah and a story that begins to explain how Judah is transformed from being a villain. I mean, he was more or less responsible for selling Joseph to Egypt as the older brother. But Judah is transformed to becoming that person who confesses his and his brother's sin when they meet Joseph and he reveals his identity to them. And Judah actually offers to become a slave in the place of his brother Benjamin. So this transformation qualifies Judah to become the leader amongst his brothers. And in that regard, it points forward to the ultimate Lion of Judah who was willing to become the ultimate slave in place of all of us.
Okay, good. And last one is about Genesis 2:4 to 4:26. Breaks the continuity between Genesis 1:2 to 4 and Genesis 5:1. Moreover, Genesis 2:23 to 25 connects with Genesis 4:19.
It's really a question about the redaction of these texts. And again, we almost have to be in the head of the author or redactor to answer the question why the texts are put together like this. The backbone of Genesis consists of genealogies, and the first one we have in Genesis 2:4. This is the story of the heavens and the earth, or these are the generations of the heavens and the earth. In other words, this is the beginning of the story of humankind. And the next one we have in Genesis 5. This is the genealogy of Adam. And then we have it 10 more times in Genesis. And it seems that this genealogical history has been made the backbone of Genesis. But in the course of time, or perhaps even from the beginning, this genealogical history has been supplemented by other texts or narratives. The creation account in Genesis 1, from 1:1 to 2:3, has been prefaced, this genealogical history, as a introduction to it, and for that sake to the whole Bible. And then we have other stories, for example, the story about Cain and Abel in Genesis 4. We have the flood story in Genesis 6 through 8. We have the Tower of Babel story, which are not, strictly speaking, part of the genealogical history, but they have been incorporated, so to speak, in that framework. So when we, from our point of view, with our expectations to the text, think that there are interruptions, I think it's because we have this framework that has been supplemented with texts, and very often we do find clues in the text why it has been supplemented with those stories. For example, the Tower of Babel story, which is squeezed in between the genealogies of Noah and his sons and Abram's father Terah, serves to underline the negative climax of humanity's sin and repeated fall after the flood. So we have a negative climax building up to the call of Abraham. So there are reasons for those interruptions as we see them.
Incredible. Thank you, Dr. Kofoed. And at the summary, can you say, does those discontinuities that I asked you last half an hour show that there are multiple sources, or would you disagree with that? Can you say something?
Yes, I do disagree with that. And the main reason, from a historian's point of view, is that there are other explanations, and I think explanations that better account for those irregularities in the text. It has to do with our expectations to a text, and one of the problems which I mentioned at the beginning of the interview is that the Old Testament and even the Pentateuch is a completely unique text seen in the context of the ancient Near East. So what do we expect? We really don't know because we are dealing with a unique text. From a believer's perspective, if you allow me to finish with that remark, I have come to believe in the same God as Abraham and Moses. I do believe in Yahweh, and the trust I have in Him makes me liable to read the narratives as historical, reliable accounts of what happened in world history, but also about how God intervened in world history. This is no proof, of course, of the Bible's reliability. And when I discuss the text's reliability and discuss source criticism with colleagues in the academy, I need to, positively speaking, put my faith aside, not hide it. I admit that I am a believer and that I'm liable to respect the text as historically reliable. But the same way my colleagues has to put away their prejudices and work as historians, I also need to work as a historian and ask for the best possible explanation of how the text was composed. And when I do that, I do find better explanations than the documentary hypothesis.
Well, thank you so much. Please let me ask you this. What do you think about view of Daniel Block or Benjamin Kilcher? They say that maybe Pentateuch is written in the time of United Monarchy, and later text is updated through centuries. So, but basic text is from time of David, let's say. So, what do you think?
Um, again, we don't have any text that says that Moses wrote Deuteronomy. So we have to be open to various explanations. And again, the best explanation wins. I do think personally that since even Deuteronomy mentions that Moses wrote things down, it's likely that parts of Deuteronomy is earlier than the United Kingdom. But again, I find no problem in redaction and updating as long as the redaction and updating are not inventing things, inventing history, changing real events to be imagined or wrongly remembered events. And I don't think that's the point of Dan Block and Benjamin Kilcher either. So this is crucial.
Yes, and do we have time for explaining your dissertation? Not many, but just a little. How you prove that memory is good enough to have faith in that it's reliable? How
Mm.
can you explain that memory is enough?
In my PhD, I was working with the Books of Kings. And what I did was to point out that the Books of Kings are no different than other sources from the ancient Near East. I mean, we do have inscriptions on stelae who are contemporary with the events they describe. When the pharaohs and the Assyrian and Babylonian kings erected stelae and told about their victories, those texts are, of course, contemporary with the events they describe. But if you take any other literary text from the ancient Near East, um, you can take Homer's Iliad, you can take Thucydid's history, and the Roman history writers' texts. Um, um, the same phenomenon is going on. We don't have the original text. We only have very late manuscripts available. So in each case, you have to argue that this very late copy is a reliable copy of the original. And this is no different when you go to the Old Testament. So having said that, you can argue that if you take, for example, Livy's the Roman history writer Livy, his history of Rome, and uses that as a historically reliable account of ancient Rome, there is no need to discard the Book of Kings as a historical source, because it's the same problem. Then I also looked at transmission history. How were different types of texts transmitted in the ancient Near East, and demonstrated, or at least tried to. Some people were convinced, others not. But I tried to demonstrate that when it came to what I called identity-related information, that is, historical information that is crucial or important to your identity as a group or a people, it tends to be preserved very reliably. And if that is the case in all ancient Israel's neighboring countries, why shouldn't it also be the case in ancient Israel? And again, it's an argument, not a proof, but an argument for the reliability of the Book of Kings, because the information in the Book of Kings is crucial to the identity of the Israelite people. I also did a number of other things, but these are just examples of how a historian needs to tackle the problem of, for example, the Book of Kings as a historical source.
Yes, I saw an article about Saul, but yeah, that's whole another topic.
Yeah.
But thank you. And last question, please. This is the biggest argument for documentary hypothesis, Genesis 37:8, about Joseph. Who sold him? Midianites or Ishmaelites, or how you explain that narrative? If you can please explain. And that's the last question.
Yeah. It's probably also an example of the same people having different names. We don't know exactly how the relationship was between various groups in Canaan at that point in time. But it is an example of how an isolated text or an isolated problem cannot be answered in isolation. If you have a critical, and by critical I mean source critical approach to the Old Testament, you will see evidence of sources in that verse. If you come to the text with a different approach, like I do, you'll tend to look for other explanations. The crucial point is that if there are no other possible explanations, then the source critical one is the best explanation and should win the day. But if there are other possible explanations, then we at least have to acknowledge that the jury is out. Yeah.
Yeah, so again, interdisciplinary method. We cannot only look text without archaeology and other stuff. Yeah.
Exactly.
Nice. And you're someone who learned from kitchen. I recently, I believe yesterday, heard that he is in hospital. He is really sick, and I don't know if he will live too much. So, can you say about him? He is my really favorite scholar, and how is it to learn from him?
I spent a year in Liverpool as part of my PhD studies with Alan Millard as my doctor father. I didn't knew Ken Kitchen very well when I came to Liverpool. I had met him, and actually, when I gave my first paper in English at Tyndale House in 1998, he was present and came over to me after my paper and said, I'll pray for you. And not only because the paper was dreadful, but because he had made it an important task to pray for upcoming scholars. And when it turned out that we were going to Liverpool, I had my family there as well. He became a dear friend, and we've kept in touch until he caught dementia a couple of years ago. I haven't visited him for some years now, but through Jim Hoffmeyer, I receive news every now and then about his condition. But he's very ill, but he is also very old.
Thank you, Professor Kofoed, for sharing your expertise and insight with us. To our listeners, we hope this discussion has been as enriching for you as it has been for us. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share this episode with others who are passionate about this intersection of faith and scholarship. See you next time on NT Podcast.